Maybe you've heard the idea that being woke is a lot like being part of a religion. Well, as a religious person, I think I can testify to this pretty strongly, so let's go ahead and talk about this idea. So hello everybody and welcome back to Grace Nerd. My name is Eric if you're new to the channel. If you enjoy Christian theology or talk about the Christian life or commentary on culture from a Christian worldview, then make sure that you go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you know when new uploads happen. If you enjoy the video, then make sure that you go ahead and leave a like. Or if you've discovered the podcast in audio form, then make sure that you follow wherever you are. So when I talk about a certain set of ideas functioning like a religion, in this episode I want to focus in on the idea of evangelism, because this is an area where I think the topic I want to tackle today becomes really clear. I find that a lot of people who would consider themselves non-religious or secular, they consider themselves to be pretty open-minded. Now, as a Christian, I believe that people do ultimately have a very deep and unspoken knowledge of the existence of God, even if they don't acknowledge it. But that's not to say that there are people who consider themselves secular who don't manifest a certain open-mindedness in conversation. There are many people of many different worldviews that I've had very fruitful conversations with on various topics. And if it's a really interesting conversation, that usually means that we're able to add to each other's thinking and there's a give and a take and we learn from each other. But I think you all will know what I'm talking about when I say that there is often a moment in a conversation when you see that someone is shifting over into an ideology, when they're shifting over into a committed set of ideas. Now again, as a Christian, I belong to what you would call a proselytizing religion. We believe in evangelism. We believe in persuading people to our worldview. We believe that the truth of Christ and the gospel are objective realities. And therefore, it wouldn't be perfectly honest to say that when we attack this issue in any given conversation, it's going to be the same kind of give and take. And so in that sense, a conversation about faith for a Christian is never going to be merely casual. If you think about it, it would basically be impossible for that to be the case. Now, I made another video sort of touching on this topic called Ruthlessly Authentic Evangelism, and you can check that out if you like. I'll leave a link to that in the description and at the end of the video. But in that video, I really complained about what I often see in evangelism training. Often Christians are, at least these days, trained to sort of put on what you might call a faux casual persona, where we're encouraged to act like it's a casual conversation and then smuggle in some deep and penetrating questions that cause the other person to think. But I think most people are smarter than this. I think that most people can see through this, and so in that video, I encourage Christians really to put aside any kind of persona and just be honest about what they're trying to do. We should just be open about the fact that we want to share our faith with people. I think people tend to respect this kind of honesty, and it actually tends to open up the conversation a little more honestly. Now, all of that to say, I think that Christians, because they hold to this kind of a worldview, they should be able to recognize evangelism or proselytizing when it's happening to them. So if you've had the opportunity to share your faith with another person, think about the characteristics of that kind of exchange. When you enter into that conversation, you probably recognize that you're representing someone other than just yourself. You're representing Christ, for one thing. You're also representing Scripture, or at least you're attempting to. You're representing the Christian community. You're representing the church. And I think for many of us, if we mess up an encounter like this in some way, we feel that we have been unfaithful to the truth in some sense. We basically have this unavoidable understanding that the things we're talking about relate to eternity. Therefore, this causes these exchanges to often be pretty nerve-wracking and stressful for us. And on the flip side of that, if we were to walk away from an exchange like this, having foundationally changed our minds because of the conversation, that would mean that we're walking away as non-Christians. That would mean we've basically lost our faith because we've called into question the core tenets of Christianity. So yeah, for the Christian, an evangelistic exchange carries a lot of weight, and it's basically unavoidable. So now take this understanding that the Christian has of evangelism and look at the last exchange you possibly had with what you would call a woke person. Is it just me, or have you noticed that these exchanges often take on these same kinds of characteristics, only in the opposite direction? I think I see these evangelistic characteristics being displayed when I talk to a woke person. I find that woke ideology, as I've come to understand it more, as I've come to see its academic roots and things like that, I've begun to see this ideology basically as a unit. It is basically an all-encompassing faith position. It has an enemy, the oppressors of society. It has the anointed or the oppressed. It has salvation, which comes from having a critical consciousness of these different dynamics in society. And it very much has an initiated and an uninitiated. And so when a conversation with one of these people slips into this kind of evangelistic mode, what do we see? And I've seen this many times. Someone coming from this kind of perspective will often speak as someone who is not speaking for simply themselves, if they're speaking for themselves at all. They are speaking for a community. They are speaking on behalf of the truth or their own definition of justice. And you'll notice underlying the whole conversation is the very clear reality that they cannot leave this conversation having changed their minds. Otherwise, if they do, they will basically consider themselves apostates, like they've betrayed the truth that they hold to. And I've found, and perhaps you found, that you begin to sense this in the conversation when they begin to manifest a certain measure of being nervous, or it can even range all the way to being angry if you don't respond in the way that they want you to. So at work, I've seen this and heard this in background conversations or conversations that I've had myself. I remember when I was at one of my work locations, I heard a girl begin to speak in the background. I had seen her car outside, and she had a lot of what you might call woke bumper stickers full of all the typical political causes that you can probably imagine. And I remember when there was just a casual conversation she was having with a woman about, I believe it was like a gender reveal. She began to talk about the differences between men and women, and she began to manifest what you might call a social constructivist perspective, where she began to complain about all of the ways in which boys and girls are cornered into having a certain kind of personality, certain interests, certain clothing styles. And it was really an awkward transition, and I heard it for exactly what it was because I had begun to hear some of these ideas already. And what I realized when I heard the tone that she had in her voice is that it reminded me of what I've often seen in Christianity when we see someone, what you would call Jesus juke somebody. Have you ever heard of that? Someone being Jesus juked? It's when a Christian is in the middle of a conversation and suddenly they shift the conversation to Jesus when it is unrelated to anything being talked about. And it basically makes the whole room feel awkward. I'm finding that more and more as I see these woke conversations happen, it really takes on the same characteristics because you're shifting from casual conversation to ideology. And there's a certain cluster of truths that are trying to be communicated all at once. And it's not merely a give and take anymore. It is an evangelistic effort. I remember having a conversation with a feminist at another work location, and I had just seen the news story where many people had heard that Mike Pence refused to meet with women one-on-one outside of his wife. I then saw what I believe to be an unbelievable news article that basically saw this sort of choice for Mike Pence as the flip side of the coin from when Donald Trump bragged about grabbing women inappropriately. They were able to make both of these extremes in behavior relate to misogyny, even though they were obviously opposite, one being very inappropriate, one being obviously admirable. But then I went to work and ended up in a conversation with this feminist, and she immediately locked in to this exact narrative that I saw on this left-wing news site. When I pointed out what seemed to me to be the obvious contradictions in this woman's thinking, she would double down more and more and try to find news articles on her phone that would support her position and try to come up with more and more arguments. It was clear that she was committed to not leaving this conversation with her mind change. I remember recommending a commentator to her who had a slightly different perspective, someone who I would have considered to be between me and her. But because this commentator that I recommended didn't toe the line with her, she went online and looked up a bunch of articles about this person, and none of them, from what I could tell, resulted in her presenting any arguments. She basically found authorities, according to her perspective, who condemned this person. It was obviously a very clear appeal to authority. Again, it seemed to me like a twisted version of a Christian looking to their scriptural authority. And so in the end, I don't want to imply that I believe that there is some sort of neutral ground between all ideologies where we can stand and judge things independently. I do think that all of us have an underlying worldview that causes us to filter through all the different ideologies that we see. What I'm saying is that we should at least be aware of it. And I recommend to you that you consider Christianity. In Christianity, there isn't such a strict and unrelenting divide between the oppressor and the oppressed in society. In our fallen and sinful state, we are all oppressors and oppressed within our individual selves to one extent or another. We all need the grace of Christ. In Christianity, there is forgiveness, whereas in wokeness, there is no ultimate forgiveness if you are in an oppressor class. Not unless you're willing to enter into a lifelong state of constant self-examination, constant self-punishment. However, Christianity makes sense of true humility as well as true dignity. whereas wokeness takes away both when it comes down to it. And so there you have it. There's just a few thoughts on this topic, and there's the episode for today. If you enjoyed it, make sure that you go ahead and leave a like. And again, make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want to know when new videos get uploaded. Or again, if you found the podcast in audio form, make sure that you follow wherever you are. And if you'd like to support my work on either this channel or my gaming channel, but you'd like to do so outside of the YouTube monetization system, then make sure that you check out my Subscribestar page. The link to that is in the description. Again, my name is Eric. This is Grace Nerd, and we will see you around in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.